Randall Cook, only meant to move the phone out of the way. It was lying face down on the supply cart beside the IV pump he had been sent to calibrate, and he picked it up without thinking, set it to one side, and the screen came alive in his hand before he could put it down. The lock screen image stopped him where he stood, in the middle of the fourth-floor biomedical equipment room at Allegheny Ridge Medical Center, with the smell of antiseptic in the air and the distant sound of monitors beeping through the walls. The photograph was of a boy, maybe 16 years old, standing beside a science fair display board in a school gymnasium. The board was covered in hand-drawn diagrams of a cardiac monitoring circuit, the kind of project that required actual understanding rather than internet research. And the boy's expression was the specific look of someone who had just been told he had won. He wore a Forest Glen High School athletic jacket, his hair needed cutting, and one of his shoelaces was untied. Randall knew the photograph because he had been that boy. He had built that circuit board, and the other half of the original photo, the girl who had stood on his right, who had written the software that made the circuit functional, was not there. The image had been cropped. He was still holding the phone when the door to the equipment room opened, and a woman in a charcoal blazer walked through it, flanked by two people in Caranova Medical Solutions polo shirts. She saw his face before he had fully understood who she was. Her expression moved through several things very quickly. Recognition first, then a breath she controlled before it became visible, then the particular stillness of someone accustomed to entering rooms and taking inventory of everything in them before saying a word. Celine Varda was 42 years old. She ran one of the most closely watched medical device companies in the Mid-Atlantic region, and she had apparently been carrying a photograph of him on her phone lock screen for reasons he could not yet explain. She held out her hand for the device without speaking. He gave it back. One of the Caranova technicians said something about the equipment review schedule, and Celine answered without looking away from Randall's face. For a moment, the entire room operated around the two of them as though they were a fixed point neither person could navigate around. She asked him, quietly, whether he had ever received her letters. He told her the truth, which was that he had received exactly one. Randall had been 45 years old for 3 weeks, a widower for 2 years, and a biomedical equipment specialist at Allegheny Ridge for 11. His daughter Nadia was 16 and had inherited her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness in nearly equal measure, which made her excellent at mathematics and difficult to argue with. He had been assigned to oversee the equipment verification process for a Caranova CardioSense unit that had begun producing intermittent false arrhythmia alerts on a cardiac step-down unit, pulling nursing staff away from actual patients and generating the kind of liability paperwork that hospital administrators experienced as a physical sensation. Caranova had sent a field team. The field team had brought the company's CEO, which was either a measure of how seriously they were taking the problem or a measure of how much Celine Varda personally distrusted remote reports. He found out later it was both. To understand what the photograph meant, it was necessary to go back 24 years, to a school gymnasium in Forest Glen, Pennsylvania, where 2 juniors had jointly won a regional science fair with a prototype arrhythmia detection circuit their advisor had called, in his written evaluation, the most technically sophisticated student project he had seen in 19 years of teaching. Celine Brandt had moved to Forest Glen the previous fall when her father Hugh Brandt opened a manufacturing consultancy in the area and decided the school district was acceptable. She had walked into the AP Physics classroom with the measured composure of someone who had changed schools before and understood that the social geometry of a new building reorganized itself around newcomers, either in welcome or avoidance, and had already decided she was indifferent to which. Randall had been sitting 2 rows behind her. During the first lab session, he asked whether she had read the supplementary paper on signal processing that Mr. Adler had listed as optional because he had questions about one of the methodology sections he couldn't resolve on his own. She had read it. She had questions about the same section. That was the beginning. They worked together for 9 months. The arrhythmia circuit was her concept, his implementation, and the documentation belonged to both of them equally. Somewhere in the middle of the project, the working relationship had become something that neither of them had a practiced name for. Partly because it was the first time for both of them, and partly because the depth of it had arrived before either of them had thought to look for it. On the night after the science fair, standing in the parking lot while their parents waited, Celine had told him she thought what they'd built together, both the circuit and whatever the other thing was worth keeping. 3 months later, Hugh Brandt's consultancy relocated to Boston, and Celine left Forest Glen in the second week of August without a forwarding address Randall could verify. He wrote to the one address he had for her, a post office box her mother had used for business correspondence. The letters went out and nothing came back. By October, he had written 7 times. By December, he had stopped writing and started understanding, or believing he understood, which is a different thing and considerably more expensive in the long run. In February of the following year, a single envelope arrived. Brief, professional in its register, signed with Celine's name. It said that the feelings of the previous year had been the product of circumstance and proximity, that she had moved forward, and that she wished him well. He read it once, put it in a drawer in his childhood desk, and did not look at it again for 24 years. He enrolled in a biomedical engineering program at a state university, built a competent and methodical career, and married Joanna Ferreri in his early 30s, a woman with a very dry sense of humor and an absolute inability to tolerate imprecision in any form, which he had loved completely. Nadia was born when he was 30, and when Joanne died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, the loss was the kind that did not announce itself in stages. It simply arrived and rearranged everything permanent about his life in a single season. He had not tried to put any of it back the way it was. The letter from Celine was still in the drawer. Celine suggested a brief conversation in the hospital's family consultation room, which was empty at that hour. Randall agreed, with the condition that he finish noting the sensor calibration readings first. The cardiology unit was still managing the alert issue, and documentation was not something he was willing to shortcut on behalf of anyone's personal history. She waited. He noted the readings. They sat across from each other in a room furnished with chairs chosen for people receiving very bad news, and he told her, before she could frame the conversation differently, that he had been married, that his wife had died, that he was raising their daughter alone, and that he was not interested in any version of this conversation that treated any of that as a preamble to something else. She heard it as the measure of who he had become and said she understood. She had written him 19 letters, she said, between August and the following April. She had sent them to the street address in Forest Glen she had gotten from the school directory before she left, and she had never received a response. She had waited through the fall and into winter, and then a letter arrived bearing his name, telling her he had moved on. She had understood it the way he had understood hers, which is to say she had believed it. She had not married. There had been an engagement, late in her 30s, to a man her father had approved of without reservation, and her own judgment had eventually vetoed. She ended it when she understood. His primary interest was in Caranova's pending IPO rather than in the woman running the company. She had built Caranova from a 6-person research operation into a $73 million device manufacturer, pushed the CardioSense program through 2 FDA review cycles, and done it while being the only person in the Brandt family who had ever actually understood what the products did. She had found him through a professional directory 3 years earlier, she said. She had seen that he was married. She had closed the tab and not gone back. Randall considered this and did not argue with the logic of it, because the logic was coherent and cost her something to say out loud. He had enough experience with decisions made out of respect for other people's complete lives to understand that the alternative would have been worse. He said he appreciated her telling him. She said she thought he deserved to know the actual shape of it. The door opened before either of them could continue. Conrad Alcott came in with the easy authority of a man who moved through spaces, as though they had been arranged for his arrival. He assessed Randall with a single practiced glance and asked Celine, in a tone positioned precisely at the edge of condescension, whether the alert issue had been identified so they could finalize the equipment review timeline. Celine introduced Randall as someone she had known before her career. Conrad said the name very carefully, then smiled with the portion of his face that had nothing to do with warmth, made a concise excuse, and left. In the hallway outside, his phone was already in his hand. The CardioSense unit had been generating continuous false signals, indicating ventricular irregularity even when the patient's rhythm was documented as stable. Caranova's internal service team had attributed the anomaly to electromagnetic interference from the hospital's new MRI wing and recommended a software patch and recertification. A plausible explanation. As it turned out, an incorrect one. Conrad Alcott was Caranova's chief operating officer, and he had been pushing for the unit to return to the cardiology floor within 48 hours because a review panel from a hospital network purchasing consortium was scheduled to observe a live demonstration. This particular network represented the largest single procurement contract in Caranova's history. The internal team had signed off on the return-to-service documentation, and Conrad had already sent the updated schedule to the purchasing team when Randall, running his own routine verification protocol, noticed something in the signal data that Caranova's service software had not flagged. The false arrhythmia alerts only occurred when the electrode array and the unit's wireless data transmitter were both drawing power simultaneously. Each component tested cleanly in isolation. Together, they generated a voltage fluctuation below the automated alarm threshold, but sufficient to corrupt the cardiac signal input by a measurable margin. Under continuous monitoring conditions, the cumulative error would cause the unit to flag stable rhythms as irregular at a rate of roughly one alert every 4 to 6 hours, exactly the pattern the cardiology nurses had been documenting for 11 days. He brought this to Everett Moss, Caranova's director of field engineering, a 61-year-old man who had spent 3 decades in biomedical device service and had the particular quality of technical attention that develops in people who have been wrong about something important at least once and have made a decision about how to live with that. Everett listened to Randall's analysis without interrupting. Conrad, who had arrived to push for departure clearance, made a remark about community hospital technicians offering diagnostic instruction to the engineers who had designed the system. 2 of the Caranova field technicians went very still. Celine asked Everett to run the interaction test. The results confirmed everything Randall had described. A secondary capacitor in the power distribution module was generating micro-oscillations under dual load conditions, and the accumulated effect was producing exactly the false signal pattern the cardiology unit had been experiencing. Left unaddressed and installed in a monitoring environment, where clinical decisions were made based on the alerts it generated, the unit represented a specific and preventable patient safety risk. Celine pulled the unit from the demonstration schedule and accepted the contractual consequences. Everett, who had watched Randall trace an interactive fault that his own field team had systematically missed, asked whether Randall would be willing to take a short-term independent review contract, reporting through the engineering office at market rate, to complete the verification process on the CardioSense fleet before the consortium review was rescheduled. Randall agreed with one condition. Every technical finding would go to Everett first in writing, before any communication with Celine, so that no one could later argue the work had been shaped by anything other than the equipment data. What neither man had registered yet was that the power distribution module generating the fault had a component designation that traced directly to a procurement change. Conrad Alcott had authorized 14 months earlier, substituting an approved supplier for an alternate vendor, whose pricing had produced a significant reduction in the unit's manufacturing cost and a corresponding improvement in the quarterly margin report Conrad had presented to the board in September. Over the following 8 days, Randall and Celine found themselves in the same building more often than the professional arrangement strictly required. Not by design, but because a device safety review at a mid-size regional hospital creates a compressed geography in which the relevant people encounter each other repeatedly, in corridors, at the nurse's station coffee setup, in the particular silences of a building that runs on 24-hour cycles. They were careful about it and honest about being careful, which was, in its own way, something. On the 4th day, Celine brought him photographs. Digital scans from her mother's archived files, drafts of letters she had typed as backups on a laptop before sending the handwritten versions, reading them in the break room. While the cardiac monitor beeped steadily through the wall, Randall experienced the specific vertigo of encountering a past that had existed in full parallel to the version he had lived. A girl in a city she didn't choose, calculating the months until she was old enough to make a decision without asking permission. Describing Boston as beautiful and completely beside the point of anything she actually cared about. He showed her his letter. She read it standing at the window of the hospital's equipment storage room, holding it with both hands, and when she finished, she said only that she had not written those sentences. They compared the signature. Her name in the particular cursive she had learned in the 4th grade, the capital S that curled left before coming around, against the letter he had kept. The curl was present, but mechanical, the way a signature looks when someone has studied it long enough to approximate the motion without having lived it. Neither of them named anyone out loud. Randall said he wanted documented evidence before any accusation was attached to a conclusion, because he had spent enough of his adult life distinguishing between what a person knew and what they were prepared to prove, and the difference mattered. Irene Strand, Caranova's legal compliance director, began an audit of the historical correspondence records held in the Brandt family's retained legal archive. What she found was that all mail processed during a 16-month window, beginning the August Celine left Forest Glen, had passed through the offices of a family services firm contracted by Hugh Brandt, and that a 20-year-old Conrad Alcott, working a summer associate position at the firm through a family connection, had been listed as correspondence coordinator for the Brandt account. Nadia came to the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon with a library book her father had left at home. She encountered Celine briefly in the first-floor corridor near the equipment intake desk. Celine did not attempt to make a favorable impression. She asked Nadia what she was studying, and Nadia said biomedical engineering, probably, though she was also interested in materials science. Celine said those disciplines rewarded the same core instinct. Understanding that the thing you could see on the surface was always downstream of something you couldn't see underneath. Nadia went home and told her father, with the careful neutrality of a teenager who had already formed a view and was allowing him to catch up, that his colleague from the equipment review seemed like someone who said things that were actually true. That same evening, Randall found the original science fair photograph in the memory box on the top shelf of the hall closet, a physical print in a paper sleeve that had gone slightly soft at the corners. Both of them were in it. Him on the left, Celine on the right, the circuit board display between them, the expression on both their faces belonging entirely to people who did not yet know what the following months were going to cost. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting he barely recognized as his own, he had written, "Built this together. Don't know what comes next. Hope she does." The story arrived in a trade publication the following Monday morning, with a photograph taken through the hospital's glass-walled consultation room. Randall and Celine in conversation, the angle removing all professional context and leaving only the geometry of two people sitting close together. The accompanying article described Caranova's CEO as having introduced a personal acquaintance into a patient safety investigation of the company's own products, bypassing standard independent review protocols, and suggested that the technical findings produced under this arrangement deserved to be re-examined for objectivity. Conrad presented the coverage to the board with the measured gravity of a man who had not written the story himself and was deeply troubled by its implications. He moved for a suspension of Randall's contract and an independent review of the conflict of interest framework. Celine documented the engagement record. Everett had initiated the contract. The fee structure had been reviewed by Caranova's own compliance office. She had not participated in the negotiations. The board received this without enthusiasm, because the story was not really about procurement protocol, and everyone in the room understood that. Conrad introduced the more serious charge at the following morning's session. He noted that Randall had been alone with Celine's phone for approximately 7 minutes before returning it. He suggested, with the particular insinuation of someone who had been rehearsing the sentence for several days, that a technically skilled individual with access to a device for that duration might have been able to extract proprietary CardioSense firmware documentation, and that the diagnostic conclusions produced by such a person might have originated somewhere other than the equipment data. Randall was placed on administrative hold, removed from the review process, and asked to surrender his facility access credentials. He complied without argument and requested continuous video documentation of every step of the process. The digital forensics review found what it found. The phone had never been unlocked. Its biometric lock had not been bypassed. The only information visible from the lock screen was whatever appeared on the display. Conrad did not withdraw the insinuation, he redirected it. A widowed technician with a modest salary, a billionaire CEO, 24 years of history, and a lock screen photograph. He allowed the implication to do the work that the evidence refused to do. Randall, reading the coverage during his suspension, asked through Irene whether he could speak with Celine directly. She came to the hospital cafeteria on a Thursday afternoon, and he told her he was prepared to step back from the investigation entirely if she believed that outcome was right for the company and for her own position. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said that if he was stepping back because he had genuinely lost confidence in the process, she would respect that without argument. But if he was stepping back because Conrad had written a story about him, and he had decided the story was easier to walk away from than to stand against, then he was handing Conrad the same thing the 19-year-old Conrad had taken from both of them 24 years ago, and she wanted him to think carefully about whether that was who he had decided to be. He thought about it for a long time. He stayed. 2 days later, Everett found a second non-conforming capacitor installed in a CardioSense unit that had been in Caranova's certified equipment bay during Randall's suspension, in a compartment accessible only to personnel with senior engineering credentials. The capacitor carried valid certification markings. When Everett opened it, the internal architecture did not match the approved design. Someone was inserting components that would not produce an immediate failure. They would produce a slow pattern of unexplained anomalies, delay the FDA recertification by months, and give a buyer with inside knowledge precisely the leverage needed to acquire the CardioSense program at a valuation that reflected the manufactured safety problems rather than the product's actual clinical value. Everett and Randall worked quietly for 5 days, mapping the component substitution timeline against Karanova's internal communication records. The pattern was exact. Every substitution had occurred within 72 hours of an engineering status report being routed through Conrad's office. The correlation was not a coincidence. It was a procurement attack executed by someone who understood the CardioSense architecture well enough to know which components could be degraded without triggering an immediate recall. Conrad had been positioning the board for months. His formal proposal, framed as a rescue operation in response to the safety concerns and certification delays, called for a sale of the CardioSense program to a medical device holding company called Meridian BioVentures, at a valuation that reflected the current crisis rather than the product's certified clinical performance. What was not in the proposal was the side arrangement in which Conrad would receive an executive appointment at Meridian and a carried interest in the acquired program the moment the transaction closed. He and the principal at Meridian had understood for 14 months that the path to the acquisition ran through manufactured crisis. They had been manufacturing it carefully. Hugh Brandt called Randall directly during this period through a formal letter delivered to his hospital office address. The letter was courteous in its language and clear in its intent. Hugh acknowledged that Randall had demonstrated genuine competence in the equipment review, but asked him, as a father, to consider whether his continued presence in his daughter's professional situation was in the best interest of either of them. Randall went to see him in person, which Hugh had not anticipated. He sat across from a 73-year-old man in a study full of industry citations and said, without particular heat, that he had left once before because he had believed Celine wanted him gone. That belief had been given to him by someone working inside the older man's authority. He had lived with the consequences of it for more than 2 decades, and he was not going to remove himself from a situation based on someone else's assessment of Celine Varda's best interests a second time. Hugh was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in the voice of someone confronting the full dimensions of a structure he had built without examining its foundations, that he had only ever asked the firm to hold the correspondence for a season, to give Celine time to settle in Boston before the summer correspondence resumed. He had not authorized fabrication of any kind. He had spent the past 2 weeks understanding what his decision to treat his daughter's happiness as a logistics problem had actually produced, and he had concluded that the only remaining useful thing he could do was be completely accurate about what he had and had not done. Irene found Dorothy Kwan through a records request from the dissolved firm's former professional association. Dorothy was 70 years old, living outside Pittsburgh, and her first response to Irene's call was a long pause, followed by a statement that she had signed a confidentiality agreement when the firm closed, and had spent 24 years organizing her memory of that summer into a shape she could manage. Irene told her, without embellishment, what Conrad was currently doing with medical devices installed in cardiac units. Dorothy said to come in person. She would have coffee ready. Her account was precise in the way that long-carried things become precise. Hugh Brandt had instructed the firm to hold all correspondence for 90 days, nothing more. Conrad Alcott, working his summer associate position and already exhibiting the specific quality of ambition that would define his career, had gone further entirely on his own initiative. He had held every letter from Randall. He had held every letter from Celine. He had composed a letter in each voice, studying the signatures until the approximations were close enough to pass a casual reading, and routed them through the firm's mail processing to arrive at their respective destinations with postmarks that bypassed the official hold. He had told Celine when he visited Boston the following December on a pretext of family business that Randall had moved on. Dorothy had seen the correspondence ledger. She had the entry numbers. 19 letters from Celine Brandt to Randall Cook, received and sequestered between August and the following spring. 14 letters from Randall Cook to Celine Brandt, received and sequestered across the same window, all of them held in a filing cabinet. None destroyed, because Conrad, even at 20, had understood that physical documents were a different kind of currency than memory. The filing cabinet had been transferred to a commercial storage facility when the firm dissolved and had never been formally requested for destruction because no one with standing to make that request had known the cabinet existed. Inside it, among the sealed envelopes, was a more recent document. A letter of intent between Conrad Alcott and a shell entity whose beneficial ownership traced to Meridian BioVentures' principal investment office. The letter described a transaction structure, a timeline, and a set of performance thresholds that together constituted the most precisely worded account of coordinated corporate fraud that Irene had reviewed in 17 years of compliance work. The same documents that proved Conrad had taken 24 years from two people. Also proved he had been planning to take the company. Celine and Randall were shown the letters that evening. They sat at the long table in the hospital conference room made available to the review team, the storage box between them, and neither of them reached for the envelopes. They understood, without discussing it, that the letters had been written by two young people who had loved each other with the uncomplicated certainty available only to people who have not yet learned what certainty costs. Those two people deserved to remain intact inside their sealed envelopes, unrevised by everything that had come after. The board convened 3 days later. Conrad structured his presentation with the confidence of a man delivering a verdict rather than making an argument. He returned, deliberately, to the lock screen photograph. A personal image, he said, that a company CEO had been carrying for reasons never disclosed to the governance structure. He invited the board to draw its own conclusions about the judgment this represented. Celine addressed it directly. A personal image on a private device was not a governance matter. It did not constitute evidence of professional incapacity. Anyone who wished to argue otherwise was welcome to identify the specific policy it violated. She was not going to pretend the photograph did not exist, and she was not going to explain herself to a room that had not once asked Conrad Alcott to explain the decisions he had made on behalf of this company. Irene presented the security audit. The phone had not been unlocked. The access records showed the equipment bay breach during Randall's verified absence. The certification markings on the non-conforming capacitors were traced to the same alternate supplier Conrad had authorized 14 months prior. Everett followed with the engineering data, presenting in his unhurried and precise manner the complete fault analysis, the component substitution timeline, and the correlation between each substitution and a report routed through Conrad's office. He noted that every technical concern Randall had raised had been confirmed by subsequent testing, and that the single instance in which those concerns had been dismissed had been the closest the CardioSense program had come to a patient safety incident. Dorothy Kwan testified by video call. Her statement entered into the compliance record by Irene. She described what she had witnessed in the firm's correspondence files that summer. The ledger entries, the letters received and held, the two documents that had gone out bearing signatures that were not genuine. Hugh Brandt, present as a non-voting former board observer, confirmed that his instruction had extended only to a temporary correspondence hold, that no fabrication had been authorized, and that he had spent the preceding weeks understanding what his treatment of his daughter's life, as a problem to be managed, had actually produced. He said this without hedging, because hedging was no longer something he had the standing to do. Randall presented last. He walked through the component serial number chain, the procurement authorization record, the timeline, and the letter of intent recovered from the storage facility. He presented it as a technical and legal record, because that was what it was, and because every person in the room had already understood the personal dimension long before he stood up. When Conrad said the signature on the letter of intent was not his, Celine placed the original document on the table and noted the intact notarial seal, the date stamp, and the fingerprint match the forensic firm had completed that morning. The board vote was not close. Conrad Alcott was suspended from all executive functions pending investigation by outside counsel. And within 10 days, by the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, which had been notified of the component substitution scheme, the Meridian BioVentures acquisition approach was terminated, and the transaction structure was referred to the relevant regulatory bodies. Celine retained her position and initiated an independent audit of the entire CardioSense supply chain, not because the board required it, but because the people using the devices her company produced, and the clinicians making decisions based on those devices, deserved to know that the systems behind them were sound. Hugh Brandt resigned his advisory role in a letter addressed to Celine rather than to the board. He wrote that his belief in his own judgment had been the condition under which someone else's ambition had operated, and that this was not a responsibility that could be shared or transferred. Celine read it, filed it, and did not respond for 2 weeks. Then she called him. The conversation lasted most of an hour and did not resolve everything, but it was the first conversation of its kind that had been possible between them, and that was where it had to start. Randall was formally cleared and received a written offer from Caranova's board for the position of Director of Biomedical Systems Integrity. He declined, for the same reason he had declined the implicit offer embedded in the arrangement from the beginning. Accepting a position inside Caranova's structure would compromise both the independence of his technical work and the clarity of every other relationship in the building. He had spent enough of his adult life in situations where the professional and personal dimensions had been deliberately confused by someone with an interest in the confusion. What he proposed instead was a partnership arrangement with Everett Moss, an independent biomedical verification unit, incorporated separately, contracted at market rate to multiple healthcare clients, with Caranova as one account among several. The unit took its first 3 contracts in the same quarter. He told Nadia about the arrangement on a Sunday morning. She listened and then asked, with the careful indirection of a 16-year-old, who had formed her conclusions well ahead of the conversation, whether Celine was going to be part of the new business. He said the arrangements were separate. She said she understood that, and asked again whether Celine was going to be around. He told her they were working some things out. She said that seemed like a reasonable approach to most things, and went back to her textbook. The months that followed moved at the pace of 2 people who had learned not to hurry conclusions. They saw each other when the work brought them to the same building, which was often enough. There were dinners that were not announced as anything particular, but that both of them showed up to having thought about what they wanted to say. They were navigating the distance between the people they had been at 16 and the people they were now, and they found that the navigation itself was something both of them were genuinely interested in, which was its own kind of answer. The CardioSense unit completed its FDA recertification process 11 months after the night. Randall had picked the phone up off the supply cart with a fully re-audited component inventory and a monitoring protocol that Everett had described in his regulatory filing as the most rigorous supply chain verification process the program had undergone in its history. Randall was not in the building for the final review, because his role was in the analysis that preceded it and in the independent verification report that followed. But he watched the certification confirmation come through on his laptop at the kitchen table, while Nadia did homework across from him, and the kitchen window faced the backyard, and the evening was ordinary in every way that mattered. On the evening of Nadia's high school graduation, Celine sat beside Randall in the general seating, not in a reserved section or as a recognized donor to the school foundation, but as someone who was there because she chose to be and the reason was entirely personal. When Nadia walked across the stage, she found her father's face in the crowd and smiled the way a person smiles when they are satisfied with how things have turned out. Afterward, the three of them drove to Forest Glen, 40 minutes south, to the gymnasium where the science fair had been held 24 years earlier. The building was the same. The trophy case in the lobby still held the citation for the regional competition, a laminated card with both their names on it, Randall Cook and Celine Brandt, the project title and the year. Neither of them had been back to see it. Neither of them had known the other hadn't been back. Randall had brought the original photograph, mounted in a simple frame. Both of them, uncropped, standing beside the circuit board display, with the full future apparently ahead of them. He had also brought an envelope he had been carrying in his jacket pocket for a week. The last unsent letter from the storage box, written in November of the year Celine had left, addressed to the Boston post office box he had never been able to confirm, stamped and never mailed, intercepted before he could change his mind about sending it. He had read it once after Irene returned it from the archive and then resealed it. The final sentence, legible through the envelope's worn paper when held up to the lobby light, read, "I still think what we built together was worth keeping, both of it." Celine looked at the envelope and asked what he had wanted to say. He did not produce a ring. He did not attempt to bridge 24 years in a single sentence. He asked her if she wanted to come for dinner, to the house in Allegheny Ridge, to the kitchen table where Nadia did her homework, to an ordinary evening with no occasion attached to it that he would very much like her to be part of. He said it the way a person says something they have decided carefully, rather than the way a person says something they have been waiting to say, which is a different thing, and, in the long run, a more durable one. Celine said yes. The three of them walked out of the school together into a June evening that smelled like cut grass and the beginning of summer. And somewhere behind them in the trophy case, two names on a laminated card held their place in a story that had not ended when they thought it had. It had simply been waiting, with the patience of things that are true, for the people it belonged to find their way back to it.